Shahieda, is it all right if we go per respondent? We can go 2 questions and we'll give you a chance to respond, and then we'll move on to the next respondent. If that's all okay. All right. Thank you very much. We'd like to open, please, for your comments, questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Samantha. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Shahieda, for your insightful talk. And it was so wonderful to hear your insights, your own experience, but beyond the book as well, which I had a chance to read. I really appreciate it. My first question is, you shared in the book about how all male psychotherapeutic groups can encourage the exploration of men's tender emotions and how that can facilitate the self-transformation of men. So my question is, when we step outside of that therapeutic space, how do we make space for or encourage or nurture those tender emotions of men while also still pursuing accountability for past violence that those men may have committed? I don't know if you want me to do my other question first, or would you like to?
I think, yeah.
That was
Well, so what you are in fact asking, and you can check, I'm checking with it, is that when the men come into the men's group, right, and so we work with the feelings, and so they begin to have engagement with their tender selves. So you are saying, how do we, in the outside of the group, how do we facilitate expression of tender emotions while also holding them accountable for? I'm going to start by stating what some of the partners and people report. So the people report that that the men shift, they change, and that they, in fact, some men have become the preferred attachment object for some of their children, because where they were unavailable emotionally, the group helps them to become just more emotional, also appropriately. Right? So there is sort of anecdotal evidence that I have. I'm hoping if there's anybody who's interested in doing that kind of research, because I think that needs to be researched, you know, what you're asking. So I can see that they also self-report, you know, they would be angry, or they would, you know, respond in an aggressive manner. It's also skills. They learn the skills, you know, how to actually just engage, you know, with people. So the difficulty with what you're asking is that there is so much violence in the rest of society. So you're asking, you know, how do you, it's almost as if we expect men now to go out and be all like emotional partners, but the environment hasn't changed. So I say to men that you're not supposed to go around and now wear your feelings on your sleeve. It's laughing, you know. So there's this magic that is expected, and for me, it's also our expectations. It's unreal, you know, that and men are people, and like I said, you don't need a forebrain, you know, to be able to read we all read. I don't just share my tender feelings everywhere. I first read. It's safe, you know. So, and in terms of keeping men accountable, what I find is that they keep themselves accountable. If you properly heal, you don't need to be policed. I'm just, you know what I mean? Because the understanding of being fully human is an ethical project. And so if I'm in touch with my Ubuntu, with my feelings, Ubuntu is not kumbaya. It means I am now accountable. I am responsible. So I may not be answering your question, but I'm giving you a sense of my understanding of the work that I do and of a graduate of the men's group. A graduate of the men's group is fully human. So he's ethical and he's relational. And so he polices himself. They come back and they report, oh, I slipped there, you know. The old me kind of emerged. All of us, you know. I mean, if I think of, you would have wanted to know me when I was 20. You could still see, you know, my feistiness. Can you imagine when I was 20? You know? So we all and we all, and so we all must learn, and we must all, and I create that space where men can then, and so that they can self-police. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Great.
No, I think you're definitely making sense. I just think the difficulty lies in creating those spaces outside of the therapeutic environment, like in a university space where we deal with so many difficulties, and that's been raised already around gender-based violence and around, difficult relations between men and women, for example. I think the therapeutic space that you've illustrated in your books is such a holding environment, but then how do we create those environments outside and then still incorporate accountability in that?
Because universities are such violent spaces. You see, so that's why I don't understand when you say, because the universities are very violent spaces. I mean, you walk into some spaces and you can't even think. So thick the air is with stuff that doesn't get spoken about. So that is why I'm saying, we need to ask ourselves what we're looking for men. Are we looking in the right place, or where else should we be looking for that nirvana that we want?
Thank you. I think my my other point of interest was I'm a psychology student, and I found it really interesting that in your book you refer to psychotherapy as, and I quote this, a traditionally female domain, and you discuss how psychotherapy may be viewed as inaccessible to men due to it being feminized, is the term you use. And from my perspective, psychotherapy as a discipline was not only developed by men, but developed by men with the preferences, ideas, and beliefs of men at the forefront. But I feel that it continues to be this way today, and is dominated by research and theory that's based on the lived experiences of primarily Western, white, middle-class men. And, it was my perspective as I was reading your work that South African men's reluctance to engage in psychotherapy may not be, for me, I believe it's deeply related to the sort of patriarchal socialization of men away from sharing their inner worlds. And I mean, you mentioned it in your talk today, the scripts that are available to men of what they're allowed to do in terms of sharing their emotional worlds. And I was just wondering how you believe these ideas might fit into your work.
Well, again, you have to be clear about the fact that psychology is the prettiest handmaiden of colonialism. That psychology was made for control and for domination. So whether it is, and it is a fact because there's evidence that most of the users of psychology are female. And psychology is not just female, it's white female. Yeah. And so we must stop saying male reluctance to engage the inner world. Because if you create a space where you center a male worldview, then men don't have a problem speaking about. I have the opposite problem. I can't keep them quiet from engaging the inner world. And so we need to stop blaming our customers, especially in psychology, because business they will look at themselves and they will say, how can we change so that we attract our customers? So I think psychology needs to look at how can they change, because you must remember, before we said men don't deal with therapy, before that it was black people don't do therapy. You can still see it. You'll see it in the literature. So what is psychology then? Before they weren't open, black people, and you find still now, black people are more likely to terminate prematurely from therapy. So is it men? What is it then? Because if you look over the last 500 years, they have always constructed human in such a way that it excludes the global south. And that is why I started here, and really, I went out on a limb and I took a risk. The longest chapter in my book is about this. Because if we're going to shift South Africa, we must stop looking for easy scapegoats. Why black men are easy scapegoats? Because what men do is they will, what is the word that I use? They enact violence. So the violence doesn't really start with them, but they enact the root violences in society. So you will see the hijackings and the murder rates and all of that is out of control, but that's not actually where the root violence is. So the same with psychology. I think psychology needs to look at itself in terms of being an expression of deep domination.
Thank you, Shahieda. Thank you so much for your questions, Kate. I'm going to hand over to Pro.
Yes.
Now, if you'd like to go. Are you happy with it?
Yes. Let me begin by saying I'll share my experience firstly as a growing up boy who grew up in a violent society. Who never grew up with a father. Then secondly, I'll share my experience about the work that I'm doing in terms of responding to that question. I won't be long, I'll just give an intro. Growing up in a rural area where growing up with family that you don't even belong to. So it was a very difficult situation for me, starting to experience, being hit, physical hit or a fist at the age of about 7 years. So for me, I grew up on that stigma, being violent, fighting my own battles, because I didn't have anyone next to me who's a brother, who's a sister who can fight for me. So I grew up on that environment, being violent until at the age of 18 years. And I've spent a lot of time in prison for heist. So because I wanted things to be quick, I need something that is going to make me to be seen there, that I am a man, see me, because I have everything. I want to build my own home because, so I grew up on that environment, and then I met gender reconciliation, and I became a facilitator in gender reconciliation. My experience into your first question is, I like the statement that was saying, truth is the only healing. Speaking up the truth is the only healing. In gender reconciliation, mostly we build a circle where we build a safe container where men can be able, or women can be able also to speak out, right? Because they want to speak out the truth, but not as victims, but as truth telling. So that itself, it's a healing, because you've spoken out the truth. So that is the answer of the first question. But how do you, in an outside environment of the university? For me, as just Dr. Jansen was saying, mostly university are the most violent place, but also outside, as I said, that truth telling, because we give techniques after they have spoken up the truth. There are techniques that if you find yourself that you are find yourself in a trauma, what to do. Those techniques, they are part of the healing. They're going along with those techniques. So once you find yourself that, okay, now I feel that there's that, fight and flight, I want just to move away. The techniques that you have to maybe finger hold, butterfly, hold. So there's a lot of techniques that we give so that they can be able to be not so in that environment of being in a depression. So there's that certain techniques that we give all times. So that's my experience.
Thank you. Shahieda, would you like to respond?
I was making notes when you were speaking. I just want to, as I go along, what I have picked off, the vast majority of men, and I say that in the book also, growing up, there's no apprenticeship with the adult male. And the vulnerability of young men not having somebody that can protect them. Is what you said, and the physical abuse that you suffered. And so, but the actual point that I want to make from your story, which is in my PhD, which was supervised by Professor Atele, in my chapter on the theoretical framing, I used the sociology of emotions to make sense of violence, because That is why it's so important to connect violence with the state-sponsored, with the foundational violence, because we're setting up black men as if they're just these wild, crazy beasts that just like wake up in the morning and they start shooting and they start hijacking and raping and pillaging, and because that is the colonial trope, right? That we all, including us black people, we internalize that about our own brothers, right? Whereas in that theoretical framing, I said that if a black man grows up in a society where he can't even, he's been looking for work, it's now the 7th year that he's sitting on the side of the road. He sees other men are having good jobs, good space, he doesn't have. So when he starts to feel a sense of envy and a sense of injustice and a sense of unfairness that later becomes feelings of aggression and violence. We are not condoning violence, but that violence is beginning to make sense. There's a logic to violence. So I'm not saying, because all societies, that is why we have the 10 Commandments. As a Muslim child, I learned the 10 Commandments and I was socialized, right, in the Christian tradition all over the world. We know what is right from wrong. When I go to Brandvlei and Paulsmoor, those guys begin with the confessions. I have to say, look, I'm not here for that, okay? I'm here, I just want to do my job, right? Because people understand right from wrong. What we must stop doing is to set men up when we only tell part of the story, GBV, in a very narrow way. We're setting black men up as these wild beasts. But when we start making sense of it, we were listening to him now. We're creating, it's the men's group here, okay? So he's talking. What did you feel when he said that he was only 7? What? A child. He's in a family that's not even his family. So he's just a thing in that family. What do we feel when we say, we're not these wild beasts? So the only comment that I wanted to make is of the sociology of emotions, and it helps us to see that violence is complex. And we must begin to see the violence in our own niceness, our own sweetness. Very violent sometimes. Yeah?
Thank you. Would you like to respond to Shahieda in brief?
Ma'am, is not a respond more than, as I said, that's my experience. I think one thing that helps me, because I never grew up with my mom, and that makes me feel less when I see each and every woman. I started even to date in a late stage because I feel so less as a man. Because each and every time I never get that tender care of my mother. I never have the love of the mother. So every time when I come closer to a woman, I will feel lesser. But as I said, that what helps me is because this work that I'm doing, it's a healing work. Each and every time I'm facilitating the program, doesn't mean that I'm the expert, but I'm also getting healed. But I'm just directing the program. So I don't claim to be an expert of gender reconciliation, reconciling the genders, but I'm also directing the program. So gender reconciliation help us, the men and women, and also those who doesn't identify either men and women, to reconcile. As I said, we build a container, a safety container that all the gender identities will share their own stories, but not as victims, but as truth-telling of their own story. So the healing is a process.
Thank you so much.
Yes, my questions. Thank you so much for the discussion, your talk, your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and like one of the things that you said really stayed with me. It was, let me quickly go down my notes. Okay, yes, healing requires you to form a circle. So when you were talking about like the healing work that needs to be done, But what I also really liked is how he said to psychologists, I guess, and social workers that it's healing is not charity, and even the way of diagnosing is violent in these spaces. That really, yeah, I had to sit with that one because as a social work student as well, having clients and having to be in communities and working with people, it makes these concepts that we speak about in academia real when you're actually in the field or when you're in the context itself. And I don't think, and I think spaces like this are limited in really explaining. So I think your presentation really allowed space to almost you have a picture of what it is that you're talking about if you know the context that you're talking about as well. So I think you drew a really great picture for a space like this. That I think we talk about a lot of things in academia, but do we practice them and do we live them every day? And the people we write about as well, do we actually understand? So I really liked your talk, and it reminded me of I have a cousin who passed away a couple of years ago, and I grew up with him, and he turned to he became a gangster. You know, he's from Gux. I'm from Gwalanga, and my cousin lived in Gux and in New Cross as well. So he go around the family, like to my grand, to our house, my mom, who was his aunt. And he started acting out, in high school. And because of the gang wars, if you know the context, you'll know how it went in Cape Town. He went to school in Athlone, but some of his friends, the story. If you know the context, you'll know how these things went. But he was violently murdered, because he was part of this gang. And I struggled with that death a lot because for me, I knew him as my cousin. I grew up with him. He was just a boy. We were little boys and girls together in our house, in our family. I would sleep in the same bed as him. He's my cousin. To speak in concepts and to speak through all these amazing theorists and all these things, but how do we then do it? So that's my first question. This is a long now.
You answered the question she asked that I didn't do a good job of answering. You answered it so beautifully now, because she asked, how do we still have the empathy, which clearly comes through in your narrative about your cousin, but again, his mother said, but I can't throw him away, But she asked, but how do we still keep them accountable? So it's and I don't think it's a question that I can answer, And I think you did it so well now, it's with the empathy that you brought. So I'm feeling now, sure, it's so emotional,
Wow.
Sure.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
I think the one thing that your empathic response to your cousin, and I guess it's a grieving response. Thank you. That you remind me is that maybe it's also a little bit of confession time, because during the briefing with Tandile, I think I got upset with her for asking me to speak about gender-based violence when I got my brief, and maybe part of, because you're bringing this now, thank you, because I wanted to check with her. So just because my book's got a black male face on, I must not talk about violence. Hi, Sissy, So I had that reaction towards her, because I guess most of the time I'm there where you sitting. You must also remember where I grew up. I grew up in a gang infested. Many times when I go to the prisons, I meet peers, men that I used to find attractive when I was 16, and my mother, wow, because these were the men around me who sang Chocolate Girl for me when I was 16, And so I think my own positionality is that I had a far more holistic view of what other people just see, as gang sisters. You know, it was my mother sometimes who opened the door and let them eat them, you know, because that was the Ubuntu that I grew up with. That people are not the other. And the thing that, because what you're raising is about the social distance between ourselves and men, especially black men. You ask the average psychologist here in the southern suburbs, or perhaps in the north, when last do you have a black man in your practice? Yeah, and you hear the responses. So I think what your response is bringing is that we need to create spaces just be together as humans. We're not doing that. We're so busy being clever, you know. So sorry, I'm apologizing. Siswam. Ukolo.
Because I spoke loud.
Before, I just want to add, in terms of the empathy part, Dr. Jansen is talking about. The empathy part cannot just be done unless you create a circle. Then this is where you will experience that empathy part to each and every individual in the circle. It can't be done because there should be a truth telling. Somebody have to come up with the story, and this is where you are creating the empathy part.
Because I also was wondering if you then, in your research, if you spoke to to the different cultures, you know, where, like, because there's also, they do speak about masculinities in the different cultures in South Africa. So I'll speak because I'm Xhosa. So through the initiation process of becoming a man, does your work go there, or does it leave that's its own thing that you're not gonna go into? Because I mean, apparently, I haven't gone through the process myself, but what you hear is that, you know, they talk about how to be a man, you know, it's between when you go, you know. So I wonder if you kind of have a conversation with what happens there, or if that's something you kind of address. Because there are spaces for manhood. But then you said you don't go into manhood early on, so I don't know, but I just wanted to know.
You know, I say I don't go into manhood, but the way I set up the whole circle is very masculinized, okay? So I make sure that from the language that I use, to the way the place is set up, what is on the walls, the colors, you see the colors of my brochures, you saw the color of the book, okay? It's all geared to a male view. And I think that that's the first thing that men respect about coming to me, is that I see them as full people and I come with respect. I don't come with, I'm a therapist, I'm a psychologist, not at all, okay? So I do masculinize, and they also know that not only am I the female gatekeeper keeping out other women, they also know that I don't speak to the partners. I don't report on. Because remember, sometimes, you know, when I was at UWC and I had developed the first group therapy program, now psychologists are not taught how to think in group terms. They don't, like, I had to teach them, how do you actually, what do they call it now? How do you think in group terms, in terms of how do small group dynamics deal with your depression? How does small group dynamics help with you having relationship issues, right? So what is it that I wanted to say now in terms of going there is that I think, so what will happen then is that some of the, say she would be an individual therapist and she would be referring to my group, the men's group. Now we have weekly group therapy presentations. So I present my group. Now I'm reporting. She said, hi, but he never said that to me in the individual therapy. No, he won't, because when he's with his peers, because remember, I'm just a technician in the room. The people who central are the men. I'm on the side, I'm the technician. The men talk to the other men and they want to see themselves reflected in other men. And so they will bring out all the stuff they do, all the housebreakings, the bad sex or the whatever, robbing and criminal activity that they get into. They talk there because they're talking to each other, not to a therapist. Okay? And so the question then around how do you masculinize, that is why I masculinize. Because I understand as a technician that if I want the truth to come out, I must make it male friendly. It is a man den that I'm creating. So I do masculinize because, and the other point that I want to make, when I started doing this, remember I didn't know what I was doing when I started out. I was going on a hunch. And the first guys who actually used to affirm the work that I'm doing were the Xhosa men. Okay? Because they recognize the relational discourse that I was bringing, because that's where they're from. So, and me in turn, I was always looking for the Xhosa boys to join, because I also felt that they understood what I was doing. You get what I'm saying? So this work that I do, it is deeply cultural. It is masculinized, okay? However, last point that I want to make is that I think men are far less over-invested in the manhood than what we make it out to be. Because I find they are so quick to dispense of the manhood traits in order to be better people, in order to be better men or whatever. They'll dispense of the manhood thing. So I don't know if I'm answering the question that you're asking.
I think so. So my question was more, how do you converse, I guess, with how those structures are laid up in the cultural context, which in Xhosa it would be like where between you taught the values that you also speak about, the desired values in the beginning of the book, which is integrity. I'm going to not remember all of them, they're written down somewhere. Integrity is one of them, courage, I think, as well. Responsibility, and then there's a fourth one. You speak about those things, which I assume are also spoken about in these cultural contexts. Or so that's what I was. That's where I was.
When I screen a man, I tell them, and it's in my brochures, I do not screen for diagnosis. You come into this group because you are you are accountable. This is a moral group. You are accountable, you are responsible. You come into this group because you are prepared to do the work. Not for the partner, not to correct the children, this is for you, bruh, this is your mirror. So in that sense, then, it is again explicitly moral, because men, I've discovered, all men, but men seems to be more orientated towards values rather than feelings and emotions, they want to see that line, right? And so I draw that line, and then they're clear, this is my responsibility that I have to come and do in this group.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shahieda, and thank you to the respondents. We're now going to open up. We've got a little bit of time for a few questions. I know that Joy was first. Over there. Question from you, and Anal. So we'll take those four. We can take them one by one as we've been doing. Shahieda, Joy, go ahead.
Thank you so much. There's no time to ask the question that I want to ask. I want to give a bit of foundation before I ask what I want to say. I'll be very fast. In my culture, they say if you close your eyes, because bad people have been passing, when the good one will pass, you will not know. I was going to walk out of the hall because I almost started crying. I remembered what I had been through, childhood. And the question I want to ask now, and what I suffered in the academic space, my question is, how do you create healing through storytelling in traumatic experiences of violent practices that have been perpetrated against women, and you are not stigmatized? You spoke about the truth. You speak the truth in our social context. You know what I mean? And so we are trained to internalize our oppressions. You're trained as a woman to I would say it again. I mean, oral literature, African literature, they say swallow the red spit, bring out the white one. I'm a critic. Swallow the red spit, you bring out the white one. But you see, it's there. As you can see, my eyes are wet. How do you relate, create healing through storytelling in traumatic experiences about violent practices, and you're not stigmatized? As a Black female academic, I faced violence, but I summoned up courage because I already had one man in my life, and I said, I can't deal with two. I'm legally married to one. I wake up, I see him every day of my destiny. I'm yet to put his brain in the right shape. Then you have another one who is, and nobody knew. He looks very quiet, but he would say terrible words to me in the office. He would speak to me very badly. Like at one time he came out, he shouted, sors d'ici, tu ne viens jamais ici avec cette lettre. Nobody knew. I was the one that was faced with it. But I told myself, listen, I'm the one who wants a PhD. And I'm too old for this. I was already getting close to 40. And I said, you die, I die. I'm going to speak the truth. But it cost me so much in South Africa. For you as South African, you can speak. Expect me to speak so that I lose my job. Expect me to speak so I don't find a space. You expect me to speak so that I go to Dr. Sam and say, please, can you lend me 100,000? You don't expect me to speak. Then that's what I'm saying to us. We need to be practical. The storytelling, the healing. How can this be created? Thank you so much.
I'm not sure you have to guide me here in terms of whether I'm answering your question, because I don't think I can, again, I can't answer this question. I can only say that, you are asking this question as an African on the continent of storytelling.
Yes.
Okay. If there's an African art of note, is storytelling, right? But I also think, you spoke to it, is like, we have to ensure that it's safe to tell the story. And what I'm hearing from what you are saying, that it wasn't safe.
It wasn't safe.
And I agree with you, it isn't safe. So be very careful when you are invited to tell your story. Okay? It's your job to make sure to scout and to see what is the cost. Your career. Are you being invited to commit career suicide? Yeah? There was one guy that came to see me. In fact, he wasn't a student at UWC. I wasn't supposed to see him, okay? But his friend brought him. He was having very violent fantasies of killing, murdering, and raping. And he was disturbed. So what we call in psychology, he had ego dystonic fantasies, right? And his friend brought him to me. And when he first started to look for help with his fantasies, they called the police. And this man was open to changing, because when he was only 10, his mother threw him with a knife. The what's the name was still there. So I immediately, as a trained person, I could interpret and decode, why he was having these terrible murderous fantasies. But they called the police. And all he wanted to do was to start telling his story so that he can heal. So I think that's all I can say. Thank you so much for...
Thanks, Shahieda.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Irkhan's master's student in the sociology department. And my question is, and I feel in the way that you're discussing the work, the therapy groups, that you might have similar tension with the question I'm asking. And my question is, should we still maintain masculinity as an ideal? Is it something worth maintaining? And I feel I really appreciate the way in your therapy group you still work within masculinity. Because I think when we address big issues, sometimes we need to talk with inner logic to undo it. That you can't just always come from outside and say, well, you just need to give up your logic. So you need to work within the person's logic to show them the limits of them. And I really appreciate that. But long-term, forward-thinking, because a lot of men are not going to give up masculinity. That's just a fact. But long-term, for like, if we look for generations of the future, do we want in 100 years still masculinity to be a thing that exists? And I ask that from a queer perspective because for a very long time, growing up as a boy, masculinity is something I should have aspired to. And being queer, later on I realized I'm never going to achieve the masculinity that people want me to achieve. So I gave up on masculinity. And at first I felt like a wound. It felt like I was denied something, a birthright. But then the more I gave up masculinity, I started to unlearn masculinity. And as I began to unlearn masculinity, I felt more human. I felt more full. And I feel like every year I become less man, less masculine, and less masculinity has a call on me, makes demands on me. The more people can say, but you're a man. And I say, I don't care. If you see me as a man or not, I'm not going to live up to your ideals of masculinity. The more I feel free, and I feel I've become less of a man, but I've become more of a human in becoming less of a man. And long-term thinking, do we want to maintain masculinity? If we don't maintain masculinity, what comes after masculinity?
Wow. Wow, the post-masculine world. Thank you. That's a very fascinating question. Wow. I'm looking at my panelists for help. You know, I was once at a conference, and secondly, I also once had to review, to do a book review, where the author and this conference presenter actually advocated that we should get rid of the idea of masculinity. But it also reminded me of the German general in that time's Southwest Africa, Namibia, when he gave the instruction, exterminate, and they slaughtered the Herero, the Nama, you know. And so I think there's in the psyche, you know, of people, of the way they want to deal with things is to say exterminate, is to get rid of things. And I think that, I even think that to be such a violent way of responding. So, because, you know, there's a lot of self-hatred in men. You remind me of that. And I think men are engaging in different ways in a lot of self-annihilation, wanting to slash the masculinity, okay? I think that, because you also pulled in there the concept of human, you know, as I think a lot of what we talk about in gender terms is not gender at all, you know. It's not about masculinity at all. It is about perhaps so much of violence that we had experienced, just an attack on the human. I mean, when he was 7, what ideas of manhood did he did not fully yet, you know, was not fully yet located in because he was too young. And yet the violence, because I think around about the age of 2 years is when the boy already, his impulse to start looking for an available male that he can do an apprenticeship with, unconsciously kicks in. Okay? And that's where the power of women already come in. Because depending on the extent of her own gender-based violence, when she picks up a little toddler boy around the age of 18 months and 2 years, you'll see it even very comical in little boys. They start following the father around or whoever's there, sit like him, walk like him. They do it in a very comical way. But this is a deep unconscious thing that is already kicking in before you can even think properly. So I think sometimes the violence that men even talk about goes back even to that pre-verbal time, when their masculinity was not positively received at an unconscious level by the people around them. Some women do hate men, and they are raising boys. Okay? A lot of women are talking and writing about men, and I ask them, when last did you sit opposite a man? Okay, so I think sometimes what we want to resolve at the gender level lies, it only gets expressed at the gender level, the symptomatology, right? Like when you describe, because the first person that he needs to internalize as a boy is a woman. And so that wound goes back very deep. That his first wound is not even the father wound. The first wound is the mother wound. Yeah? And so how do you expect this man to relate to a woman when he was an absence of a woman, even this little boy? You know? So I'm probably not answering your question, but yeah, that's what I...
Thank you, Shahieda.
I assume the first point is I assume that the feminist must be hating you for your views, and I just hope it doesn't keep you awake at night. But you're talking about the value of life. The first value of life is to keep living. I'm just my thought always that people into violence because they're self-suicidal. Is it the correct assumption? Yeah.
So you see there is, and this is also comes through in the African concept of umoya. So, and also in the Hindu scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, they talk about the idea of being separate is an illusion. And so that is why we do not actually distinguish between the self and the non-self. So when there's self-hatred, and what I do to myself, I'm going to do it. Okay, so it's fine, you know, if I'm hated by feminists, that I can live with it. I sleep at night. Okay? But I think what is a problem for me is that we are saying that men is the problem, but we are not working. We're not bringing men. It's illogical for me. It's a paradox. The other paradox that I want to bring in, although I'm now going away from your question, is that if you must see the competition for men among women, you will be surprised. Okay? Women outperform other women so that they can get the high value men.
Oh, it's true.
So I'll stop there.
Last question, and we only have time for this one. We can continue the conversation over lunch. And Anel did have her hand up. Sorry, Bapiwe, and we can address the questions. And we unfortunately have run out of time.
Okay, I'll be brief. And my point sort of draws on the question that Kate asked earlier on. And it also draws on this context-specific approach that you're using, and context meaning not just in the space, but on a continental level as well. I don't know why the idea of centering these masculinized spaces is beneficial, but there are limits to it as well. I grew up on the Cape Flats. I'm very, very familiar with the masculinized dominoes table that my mother was never allowed to enter. I'm very familiar with these deeply masculinized circles in which it's boisterous to speak about every crime that you've committed and how many times you have taken a woman against her will, using those euphemisms for things associated to rape and non-consensual sex. And my question is deeply centered on, I see the benefits of having this conversation, and it's sort of twofold. You being, I would like you to reflect on your experiences as a woman in these masculinized spaces. And I would also like to hear more about the limitations thereof, because these men are going into these masculinized spaces in this psychological context, but then in the psychology context, but then also beyond that, they are returning to masculinized spaces as well. Because like you said, you don't tell their wives, but they are also not speaking to their wives.
Says who?
No, but I don't have the background, so it's my question. I think that's part of my question. It's what is the limitations there?
Thank you. I think it's a very loaded question, but I just want to say, you know, that coming from the Cape Flats, one of the things then that my mother was so good at protecting me from, because having sex was synonymous with violence. There wasn't even a sense of how you actually approach a woman in a non-violent way. Okay? I wasn't aware, I couldn't, I had to be protected from myself, which is what my family could do, is to protect me, right? Because, all I wanted was to experience what it was, But what I think, you are asking is, I think you are talking about how men enact the violence that is in their context. So if you think about the Cape Flats, it's a violent space. What alternatives were there for men to actually create a different kind of masculinity in that spaces? So now what you are doing, you're giving power to men that they don't have. Okay? So what fascinates people, even at conferences, is that I'm a woman. Okay? And why is it then that these men that are so like masculine and all of that, why is it that they cooperate with me? Because I don't work with court-ordered men. I work with men who pay for my services, who's looking for me, who wants to come to my groups. So what I'm saying is that, and I can see that especially coming from a feministic perspective, and I'm not saying it's coming from you, but I hear that a lot. Even the people who, because my book is, peer-reviewed, the one reviewer, I could hear how they're giving power to men, especially to Black men, that they're not having, they're doing enactment from the environment. And I'm not saying that they're not guilty and that there isn't a sense of agency, but what I'm saying to you, that our agency is plastic. It always connects with where we are. And so my agency and a man's agency, it depends on where he is. And so on the Cape Flats then, where many of them were unemployed, I'm thinking of my own uncles, my own fathers and all of that. They didn't have access to other sources of that could bring a masculinity. So they had to shout and they had to enact this very bravado kind of masculinity. You give them an alternative and you'll see masculinity is so plastic. It's flexible. It's not fixed. And I think we impose our own, about men are so powerful. And I'm not saying men are clay or they're just like, but I do find that they're so open to, depending on how I approach them, because I don't approach them with do this or you. I approach them like that I'm collaborating. So yeah.
Thank you, Shahieda. Thank you to the respondents and to everyone who had questions. I know there's some more questions sitting in the room, but we can move over. We've run out of time.